Hello and welcome to this introduction to the Sapphire LensFlare Spark for Autodesk Flame. We'll be covering the fundamentals of the Sapphire LensFlare UI, the preset browser, the flare designer, variations on the Sapphire LensFlare Spark, and some general batch workflows for Flame. I'll begin by dragging a Spark node into my batch tree, which launches the Spark's browser. I'll select S-LensFlare and connect my source clip to the front input socket on the Spark node. S-LensFlare is now applied with its default settings. I'll select the S-LensFlare Spark node and hit the Edit button to launch the effect editor. I'll go to the Crop Help submenu in the editor and hit the Load Preset button. This launches the preset browser, which opens in a separate window. Here I can select a preset by clicking its thumbnail and preview it before selecting one. When I hit the Load button, the selected preset is applied and I return to the Effect Editor menu in Flame. Now I'll adjust the flare hotspot by dragging the on-screen widget. I'd like to do some deep editing of my flare, so I'll go to the main parameter submenu in the Effect Editor and hit Edit Lens to launch the Flare Designer, which opens in a floating window. Flare Designer allows us to finesse each individual element of a flare. A new preset may be created from scratch by hitting the New button. Flare presets may be loaded from the browser with the Open File button at the top left of the UI. The Insert Lens option allows presets to be combined. The viewer shows a preview of the overall effect. Scroll in the viewer with the mouse wheel to zoom and hold the right mouse button to pan. Hovering over an element in the Element panel will highlight it in the viewer, and clicking on an element will bring up its controls in the Parameter panel. Hitting Identify highlights the selected element in the viewer by increasing its gain briefly, and it can be examined more closely by soloing it and muting the background. In the Parameter panel we can adjust the position of the selected element along the Z-axis of the flare, along with its XY offset, size and aspect. We can set the brightness and colour of an element, either from a single colour source or from a user-defined gradient. Additional element-specific parameters may also be adjusted along with animation, which modifies the behaviour of element parameters over time. Procedural noise may also be added to add texture to elements. Texture overlay will use source image intensity to control element opacity. Additional elements can be added to the flare by selecting them from the preset list and adjusting them as required. Imported bitmaps may also be used as flare elements. Hit the Insert Image button to select an image to load, and the element opacity will be based on the source image luminance. Hitting the Insert Advanced Element button will allow the creation of a procedural element with the full range of parameters, subsets of which are displayed in the element preset controls. Elements can be deleted, duplicated and grouped in the Elements panel. Finally, the user-defined flare setup can be saved to the preset library and catalogued by hitting the Save button. Now I'll hit OK to return to the Effect Editor in Flame. If I select the LensFlare autotrack option, the flare hotspot will be tracked to the brightest area on my source clip. As this clip is a bit noisy, the brightest area isn't clearly defined enough, so the results are a bit jumpy. In the Parameters 2 menu I can apply a blur to the luma input for the flare to improve this. In order to finesse this further, I'm going to use a different version of the S-LensFlare Spark. I'll delete the basic LensFlare Spark and load the S-LensFlare Track Spark, which has a dedicated input socket for the track source clip. I'll feed the source clip into the track input and insert a colour corrector upstream by shift dragging it into the connection line. Now when I adjust the colour correction, this influences the behaviour of the flare. In order to adjust this in context, I'll right click the flare node and set this as context 1. Then I'll set my second viewport's output to display context 1. Now I'll adjust the brightness and contrast of the track input in order to achieve a smoother track. Now I'll go to the flare node, hit the edit button to launch the effect editor and adjust the initial hotspot position as required. The hotspot now moves relative to the track from its initial position. Next I'll tweak the effect parameters in context. In the next example there's no obvious luma hotspot to track the flare, so I'm going to use the S-Mocha spark to draw a mask for the flare tracker to follow. Once again I'll hit the S-LensFlare track spark and connect the source clip to the front input. Next I'll add the S-Mocha spark, connect the source clip to its input and its output to the flare track input. I'll hit the edit button to launch the effect editor. When I hit the Edit Mocha UI button, the Mocha UI is launched in a floating window. I'll click the Draw X-Spline Shape button, plot the points on the shape I want to track, and right-click the mouse to close the shape. I'll hit the Track Backwards button to track to the start of the clip, and then track forwards. In order to animate my shape on the fly, I'll stop tracking, select some vertices, and move them. A keyframe is automatically added for the roto because the auto keyframe button is enabled in the transport controls. Now I'll continue tracking to the end of the shot. When I hit the Show Mask button, the mask is displayed over the source image. I'll hit the Save Mocha Project button to store my animated mask and hit the Exit button to close the Mocha UI and return to the effect editor. Now I'll add a little blur to my mask. When I scrub the timeline, we can see the flare origin is now tracking the luminance of the Mocha mask clip connected to the flare track input. Now I'll launch the effect editor for the flare mode, align my flare origin point as required, hit the Load Preset button to launch the browser and select a preset. Now I'll return to the editor and tweak the flare settings in context. Finally, we'll take a look at S-LensFlare Mask, which uses a mask input to occlude the flare. I'll add S-LensFlare Mask and connect my source clip to the front input. Next, I'll add a keyer node, connect my source clip to the input and pull a key on the sky. Now I'll open the S-LensFlare Mask effect editor and invert the matte to restrict the flare to the sky. When I scrub, we can see that the flare is occluded by the rocks in the foreground.